Rogue Squadron, this is General Riken. One of our shuttles will rendezvous with a small convoy from local resistance on Barkesh, which must first travel through Imperial territory. They carry equipment and supplies vital to the rebellion. Your mission is to rendezvous with that convoy and escort it to the landing zone. Good luck.
Space, a word that takes many meanings and a place with endless possibilities for creativity, expansion and storytelling. Many of the modern film greats have been set in this black curtain of mystery, hunting xenomorphs to errant computers. Likely the most famous series to be set amongst the stars, though, is one of a common occurrence within mankind: war. It was a simple tale of growing up and finding a purpose, a place within the world. It captured a generation, allowing your imagination to run wild, and was the backdrop to my early childhood. Removing the confines of our lives and the fashion of the times provided it an almost ageless trilogy of movies, setting a new benchmark for visual effects, sound production, box office draw, with effects so convincing in fact at the time, due to this unearthly setting fooling the eye and the brain much easier. The series started life as a cutting-edge technology piece of cinema, and this carried over to the games market. Many companies have used the license to deliver bleeding-edge technology and jaw-dropping visuals. The recent Frostbite-powered games are the modern-day equivalent of this, pushing current hardware to extraordinary heights that rival the films. But DICE were far from the first to achieve this, and certainly not the first to equal the film's visual punch in pixelated form. Before we dive into one of those true next-gen moments, we must factor in how this journey came to be. Let's look back. Lucasfilm maximised the lore and universe by creating an assortment of video games from the franchise almost alongside the cinema releases, licensing it to the big players at the time and holding the honour of the first licensed Star Wars game. Parker Brothers snapped it up for release on the all-conquering Atari 2600. A simple affair set completely on Hoth, showing even then all knew this sequence would make an incredible game. A dull affair, but it had little to no competition at the time. Hey, this was the best you could get at home. But Atari stepped up the following year with a game that is one of my first major video game moments. Being greeted with this sit-in full cabinet as Darth Vader's voice beckoned was almost another galaxy to me. Vector graphics designed around another ideal game moment, the attack on the Death Star. Getting good at this game meant your 10 pence went a long way, something I learned well. This was the moment I realised just how incredible games could be. The immersion of the 3D graphics, the sampled soundtrack and closed off cockpit transported you away. I do miss those heady days of arcades and how they were as much about the experience as the graphics. Now this dated as a greater deluge of titles and machines hit the market. It found its next leap thanks to the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 effect. All three games not only becoming big sellers for Nintendo, but system movers due to the exclusivity they had from its Sega rival. This was when system exclusives really became a mainstream thing. Launching across side a little over 2 years from the tail end of 1992 to 1994, slightly later for us Europeans, and thanks to the scaling and rotation effects became a technical showcase once again. Now in between this happening, the IBM compatible PC market was really blooming and had now become fast enough to deliver a leap over the Atari arcade vectors. Now the ships were all represented in full 3D polygons as you took on the Empire as part of the Rebel Alliance in X-Wing. Lucasfilm had been a big supporter and player in the emerging PC market. Building up the point-and-click adventures, mixing up the bitmapped animations with polygons was a great balance of the available CPU and memory resource to present a 3D simulation. It became one of the best sellers at the time and was exclusive to the PC market. Console players did not have to wait long though for their own dose of polygon pumping battles, as Sega licensed their own version for the arcades and later the doomed from birth 32X. Now this was a fair crack and an exclusive hitter for the machine, certainly pushing more flat shaded polygons than X-Wing, having enough grunt to deliver a semi-smooth game with sampled sounds. The performance metric here is deceiving, as like many games on Sega's hardware, it interleaved the updates between polygons and sprite objects. Specific to the 32X was was the video from the Mega Drive fed through the 32X, with many titles sharing the final output to screen from these two buffers, similar to the Saturn's VDP-1 and VDP-2 split buffers. In actual fact, the polygons update at around 25 to 17 Hz, but the screen updates still at 50 Hz from the HUD or the star fields. It suffered from what Sega struggled with for a very long time, understanding that great arcade games do not always make great home ones. The action is repetitive and tires quickly. It was also far from the most impressive looking title on the system, which is saying a lot, as the machine had a short life and a frugal library. It may have shared a similar aim as X-Wing, but I played far more of that on my Pentium PC than I ever did on my 32X. It would have been a few years later until the series would reach for the stars once more and achieve more from the series than the sparse but engaging space battles. The platform would have once again been Nintendo's, and rather than licensed to another publisher such as JVC, this time Lucasfilm could publish it for themselves, but they needed a company to help them achieve this. The chosen company was not some huge AAA behemoth, instead having foundations right back to the late 80s and the Amiga demo scene as Light Circle. The 5 German members were studying at university at the time as they dabbled in this home coding and made a name for themselves with an R-Type ripoff, Catechus. So good, in fact, it caught the attention of Activision, who owned the rights, offering them a choice: convert R-Type to the Amiga or face a lawsuit. Decisions. Giving them the leg up they needed, and quickly demonstrated the technical prowess they would become famous for. The later R-Type conversion was equally as impressive. By now they had truly become a factor, but the next title in series would rocket this German squad of tech heroes firmly into the hearts and minds of all, with Turrican from fellow German company Rainbow Arts, a game that pushed the Amiga and the Atari ST to the maximum, combining shoot 'em up and action platforming that sold like rubber rings to a drowning man. This Metroid-inspired hit I touched on in my Amiga and ST video, quickly ported by themselves and other teams to different platforms. It appeared on the C64, the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive, with sequels and ports not all being directly handled by Factor 5 themselves. Now, concluding the Super Nintendo with a title that gave them the first chance to partner with Lucasfilm and turn the whip-cracking hero into a pixel-packed adventure, this relationship would play a vital part in their future and form a partnership that would see them make the first of many Star Wars games, with Rebel Assault 2 on the PlayStation 1, again mixing FMV, full polygon action and sprites over pre-rendered backdrops across a selection of set-piece moments. Technically strong, but lacked long-term appeal, or the core hook that Turrican had delivered. This was not a problem that arose once they moved over to Nintendo's Ultra 64 machine, as Lucasfilm had signed a deal to publish games for the incoming 64-bit machine, and Factor 5 were an integral part of that deal, so much so that they relocated the entire company to California to be close to Lucasfilm and help the delivery of a collection of titles on the final N64 hardware. The first Star Wars title was a dubious affair to back up the impending release of the anticipated prequels.
You saved my again.
Anyway, thankfully the Factor 5 title was grounded far more in the origins of the series and was better and more loved for it. Rogue Squadron was something we did not expect and truly took advantage of the new Nintendo machine. You see, the N64 was a powerful machine for the time, but it still had many limitations. The biggest was image quality, driven by the tiny 4KB texture cache, mip-mapping, full-screen anti-aliasing, and the emergent use of bilinear and trilinear filtering. Due to this post-work, the games all had solid and stable 3D, thanks again to the hardware-based Z-buffer. The downside was most games lacked clarity, even then, with many titles using Gurud to mitigate this loss of detail on object textures. Another was that this was the time when performance boasting was all about bit size and polygon throughput. As such, Nintendo's figures erred on the side of optimistic, as the base RSP's programming from Silicon Systems, entitled Fast 3D, limited the triangles traded for accuracy. This microcode could be reprogrammed and allow the Reality coprocessor to break through this limit. Many titles in the later life of the console used this to enhance details, draw distance, as the infamous N64 fog subsided. Now, Nintendo kept this close to their chest for many years of the console, but they leaked it to developers at the tail end to try and help them recoup the loss and get more competitive with the newer machines on the market. Factor 5 were one such studio with the technical chops to attempt this seat of your pants DIY work, and they did just that with Rogue Squadron and pushed this further still with later titles such as the Infernal Machine. It was not all about the polygons though. As packed and fast as they were for the time, the landscape itself was a core aspect of the game. Moving away from the common moments against the backdrop of stars or planet sprites, this time we could race through Beggar's Canyon, or better still, return to Hoth, last seen on the 2600, this time with a level of detail only dreamed of. The snowy landscapes all have depth and detail to them thanks to the use of height maps, one of those benefits that came from those microcode edits. Providing the organic curved look, you can see this tessellate as you fly and draw closer to the edges. A clever use in these early 3D games, as it reduced the amount of polygons being drawn on screen at once, whilst still enabling a good level of terrain detail. They also cooled polygons within the frustrum, chopping them back at the edge of the screen. Ships and enemies were all equally represented, from X-Wings, A-Wings, Snowspeeders, and even a hidden Naboo fighter all made the cut. Walking around the space base, you could pick your own ship for the battles, adding yet another level of style and diversity. A big inspiration on the title was another launch Star Wars game on the N64 in Shadows of the Empire. Having a derived story within the universe, it was a great start for the console, if not a superb game, but everyone agreed that the opening Hoth level was remarkable. The detailed reduction can be noticed in the landscapes, but the frame rate on this is free to run, meaning it can hit 60 or 50 Hz at times. It's still operated most often at the midpoint though. Flying over the landscapes, chatter from characters, and taking down the attack walkers specifically was fun and captured the famous sequence almost perfectly. The two games side by side can see the upgrades and resources that they squeeze from it. Having a fluid animation system for the cable itself, this would later be replaced with a physics simulation when wrapping around the feet in the later GameCube title. Performance can vary at times with both games, with some heavy sections tanking the frame rate, but to be honest, this was the best you could get at the time, and we all just played and dealt with it. Over most play though, it does hold close to the 20-25 FPS target and became a huge hit for the team, Lucasfilm and Nintendo, as another Star Wars semi-exclusive had arrived. Yes, it was also on the PC.
Help me out here! Fire shields down! Cable out, let her go!
Records are made to be broken, and Factor 5 had no intention of sitting on their hands. Closing out the N64's life had put them in a privileged position with Nintendo, as they were involved in the early development stage of their next-gen console in the GameCube, helping them design the audio system for it and writing the sound driver with them, putting them on the front foot to launch a title on the new machine, but the deadline was tiny.
Where did you learn to fly?
9 months to make a AAA launch title on brand new hardware with all your old tools was a big ask. The Space World 2000 demo caught everyone's eye. This was just that though, with it being a classic target render for what they hoped to achieve on the hardware based on the provided specs by Nintendo. This awareness to not get sucked in to change everything because of new hardware, simply refine and build upon it, was the biggest reason they achieved such a monstrous task. Source code was not extensively recreated or even thrown out. Rendering tricks were repeated, such as height maps and texture use, writing their own virtual memory manager to handle code and data use between the split pools of RAM and speeds the console had. An extension of the system they had written for the N64, as they used the cartridge as texture streaming sources to resolve many memory limits. This iterative solution method saved the schedule on many occasions, according to the team's own post-mortem on the game. The in-house editor, L3D, was also used again with the same internal scripting system, empowering the designers to create the levels and triggers in a similar fashion as they had been doing already on the N64, just with a greater scope to push this even further, in such areas as also the CPU resource. This was limited heavily on the N64 to the point where most enemies all follow a simple spline flight path in the game, which you can see here as both TIE fighters just fly back and forth across the same path until you shoot them down. Many of them do not even fire back at you. Obvious when you step forward, but it worked well at the time as a handful of enemies had some level of autonomy at least. With the Cube's IBM engineered 486MHz out-of-order Gecko CPU, they could achieve a lot more from both the visual, audio and AI side, which reflects in the enemies and enhanced difficulty of the title, as they now break from routine and react more often to you, but this can also be the cause of some frustration of mind, certainly in the escort missions. The techniques and tricks they added to the game were exhaustive. Bump map textures, point lights, full screen anti-aliasing, per pixel lighting at points, even volumetric clouds all appeared, proving this was a cutting edge title. Texture and asset details alone show that even though these were created after the Space World demo, as only the animation and geometry systems remained in place from that demo, the final look achieved is better than the demo itself. Using Maya to model the ships and surface details allowed the team to work on the required lighting and materials, alongside one of the earliest uses of global illumination in a game, and self-shadowing. All the ships and the scenery all look incredibly grounded and very close to the film's aesthetic and iconography. The GC multipass texturing and dual pixel shaders really helped here, as the details for the ships and the world were created by using multiple texture passes, something I covered in more detail with my Resident Evil 4 retro article. Building up the ship's surface is a composite of the base vertex colour, the dual bump map textures detail, and then the decal textures, with most objects having around 5 layers, but able to provide 8 layers of materials was a revolution at the time. Sound was still growing and expanding at a similar rate to visuals. The larger storage space on disk meant that more music, samples and speech could be loaded into a title with a less aggressive compression method, wider channels and faster memory, and CPU raised the bar again. The famous music, in-game chatter and world-famous sound effects have never sounded as good to this direct use of Sprocket Systems' portfolio and the hardware enhancements. Factor 5 could not resist pushing this up another notch, and this game was the very first title to launch with a Dolby Pro Logic 2 surround sound. The option to drive the new encoder here was a direct result of the early work on the machine, giving them that safety net of the knowledge at the time to push forward on this aspect. I remember vividly when I picked up my Cube and hooked this game up. At the time, I had it running through my hi-fi system and my Mission speakers, and the audio simply blew me away. An often overlooked aspect of games, but even now it has not aged in that regard, sounding rich, meaty and movie-like throughout play, and still sounds excellent on a surround sound system.
Nice shot.
Now this was made all the more arresting due to the return of the high frame rate that the team were always advocates for across the years. Even a team as pioneering and capable as Factor 5 highlighted the shift to true 3D hits everyone hard, and frame times were almost always the first casualty with that. They returned this metric once the GameCube hardware was ready with a mostly stable 50 or 60 Hz update across all levels and cinematics, and is another reason this game has aged so well, alongside the theme in space. It does not hold a locked rate, with some minor dips with the obvious culprits of alpha draw, screen filling geometry, or just minor streaming moments, but in play the fast action and crisp response is a welcome return of old, with a team that settled for nothing less on the Amiga days. That early demo of the game was another title for the GameCube that had many doubting what it would really look like. Looking back now, it was clear that all involved over-delivered on that promise. The collection of high polygonal models, a fully skinned animation system over the rigged skeletons, high detailed materials, real-time lighting, vast use of alpha transparency effects, and physics-based particle explosions, point-lit laser blasts and explosions, real-time seamless cinematics, and a clear passion for the series, right down to recreating shot-for-shot sequences, present the single most jaw-dropping and accurate version of the Star Wars universe in games at this point. It became that time when we could play a game that looked, sounded and felt like you had entered the films. Now, I love visuals, as anyone who has watched my work for any length of time will know, and I make no excuses for that. Equally, I am just as aware that visuals alone do not a great game make, but none can argue that they can make a good game a great one, and this is exquisitely demonstrated here with Rogue Leader. Even similar levels and missions as previous games took on a whole new level here that left you wide-eyed with excitement. With Factor 5's immense technical skill, over $3 million budget and a team of 30 created a landmark in real-time rendering within an astonishingly short amount of time. Nothing else in 2001 had this collective level of fidelity, accuracy, speed, audio quality and impact within its peers. The goal was achieved and then some on technical fronts. 2 years prior we were playing this game on the N64, and just in 2001 this is what we were playing on the very next console. Now, if that is not a generational leap, then I really don't know how to describe it in any other way. It may not play as well now as it did then, of course, but some of that is down to the analog stick layout. But when I boot up a game from 17 years ago, I still see the same magic in a bottle they captured at the time. Factor 5 were, or are, a team I have always held in high regard, and I believe if they were still around today, they would be at the sharp end with any of the current DICE or Guerrilla or Remedy et al. Of technology pioneering teams. And I only hope the rumoured return of the team and Turrican is not that far from becoming a reality. That's it. I draw to close another Retroperspective. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can help by hitting the like and subscribe below. Getting my numbers up is one of the most important things I need to do. The other is by sharing this or any other video wherever you can. Follow me over on Twitter, and if you can afford it, any pounds or dollars are greatly appreciated on my Patreon link, which is below and on screen. You guys play fast, game hard, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Awaiting your orders.
Attack the fighters.
We copy. We're going after the fighters.